lovely to be back. Great to be back at the the Festival of Education. I think I first spoke in 2016 on the 23rd of June, 2016. Which you may remember is a date of some significance. I think that was one of the greatest day in our history. Of course, the Brexit referendum, after which everything has gone so swimmingly. And now we find ourselves in a different situation and in a pandemic, which is why we're doing this virtually, although, of course, we are easing up and hugging is now allowed, although not in the Matt Hancock sense, or indeed not in my sense. The last time I hugged somebody, one thing led to another, and I now have a personal reproduction number of, is it 6 or 7? Anyway, and if you've been in contact with me and have a child, get a test. Get a test. That is my advice to you. But today, ladies and gentlemen, it's back to the Education Festival, as I say, Wellington, where I was at school. And it's interesting because if I look back at my school days, I can think of myself as being impetuous, quite inattentive, a bit of a class clown, quite irrepressible. And it was only many, many years later that I identified many of those traits as being characteristic of ADHD. And looking back at my school reports, I can see that while my tutors didn't have the expression ADHD or the acronym ADHD, they were aware that something was going on. And my tutor, actually, on my last report, he put Rory, who could be a successful entertainer if all else fails. So I think we could have called this talk If All Else Fails. But what we're going to do today is to give you some insight into ADHD, the world of ADHD, and also particularly in the context of neurodiversity, which is a concept which I think is really it's coming into its prime. It is time to be talking about these things. If I talk about ADHD, if I think about yesterday, for example, this is my life yesterday. I was supposed to be preparing for the podcast tomorrow, but Andy Murray was playing at Wimbledon. I'd interviewed his mother the previous week, so I was feeling sort of particularly, I had some skin in the game, as it were. Croatia were having a very entertaining game against Spain. I was appearing on Countdown, which Anne Robinson was taking over for the first time. And later on, there was France against Switzerland, but also I was supposed to be watching some episodes of The Americans for this spy podcast that I was doing. So there are 4 or 5 things going on simultaneously. And the reason I mention that is it's very, very characteristic of life inside an ADHD brain when there are many, many calls on your attention. It's weird they call it attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, because Tony and we dispute the words disorder, and we also dispute the word deficit, because attention deficit implies that you have a lack of attention. I think it should be attention surfeit, because you have a lot of attention on a lot of things, just not necessarily the thing that you're supposed to be concentrating on. So what we're going to talk about this time is give you a little context, a little idea of ADHD, and talk about it in the wider context, as I say, of neurodiversity. And I'm delighted to talk to somebody who really has been my mentor and my guide and my inspiration for the last 5 or 6 years of advocating really for people with ADHD, and that is Tony Lloyd, a wonderful man who has for the last 11 years been CEO of the ADHD Foundation. Tony, just tell us very briefly what the ADHD Foundation does and your role in it, how you came to it.
Well, as an organisation, we provide training for the education workforce and for the NHS right across the UK. And we also do quite a bit of work with international schools. But here in the northwest of England, we offer what is, I think, a unique lifespan service here, where we provide a whole range of different types of therapies, training and support for families right across the lifespan. So it is quite unique in the UK, and obviously the purpose and the mission was to demonstrate what a best practice model really looks like in terms of its effectiveness and also its value for money. So yeah, it's a remarkable team of people I work with, most of whom are neurodiverse themselves. Yes.
I was going to say, I should point out to
include-
listeners, Tony and I are both examples of ADHD. So we will talk across each other. We will interrupt each other. There will be a very fast flow of ideas, but that is how we roll. And I definitely, I mean, I turned to Tony and the foundation so many times since I've been making the odd documentary and radio program about ADHD. So many people get in touch with me about their son, their daughter, themselves, and often I'm able to refer those to Tony and just give them whatever advice from my own experience, which Tony's aware of. I mean, it's been a few years now since it started.
I mean, I think you became a patron nearly 8 years ago. It's indicative of the time blindness, isn't it? Sometimes that goes with ADHD. You know, and I think, again, I was always really, I think, quite inspired by, I think, your compassion and understanding for ADHD. It was, I suppose, really, it's probably a good point to say, you know, obviously you've been a patron of the foundation, but why are you particularly so passionate about speaking publicly in order to improve understanding and awareness of it, Rory?
Well, as I say, I mean, looking back, I can see so many of the characteristics that I had as a child. But then it was later on when a relative of mine was diagnosed with ADHD that that things fell into place. This is quite common with people across the spectrum. For example, Jackie Stewart, when he was profoundly dyslexic and had no idea of that till he took his son for a diagnosis, and they said, "Well, look, your son is dyslexic, and by the way, would you like to have an assessment as well?" And Jackie Stewart did, and he'd been phenomenally successful, as you know, and yet for the first time, probably in his 40s by this stage, somebody said, "No, absolutely, slam dunk, you are profoundly dyslexic." And I think he just burst into tears and everything slotted into place. But that's something we'll show as we talk about later on, how these what are called sort of spectrum disorders or whatever, which range, I come under the title now, the umbrella of neurodiversity. We're talking about dyslexia and dyspraxia and ADHD and Asperger's and all these sort of things, whereas they can give us certain handicaps or challenges. Actually, in many cases, there are hidden strengths, and they allow people to be who they are and give people incredible skills and insights. And I know that's something that Tony champions as well. But I mean, I became aware early on that this is something that 1 in 20 of the population experiences, ADHD. I explained earlier on the idea of trying to watch Andy Murray and a football game and Americans and keep up with deadlines and all the rest of it. If you imagine, my analogy is always with an open plan office. If you were sitting there, your computer is on, you've got your smartphone next to you, it's bleeping away, the person next to you is sending messages or on the phone, there's a television on the wall showing sport or news, a fire engine is going past. There are so many different calls on your attention, and that's what it's like in an ADHD brain for a good deal of the time. Now, we're all a little bit like that. We all have times where we're overwhelmed and we're trying to take on too much, or we're impetuous, or we're irrepressible. And we all have times like that. The difference is with people with ADHD is that we are like that a lot of the time. And in some cases, it impairs our ability to hold down a proper relationship or to have a successful career in some cases. Although, as again, we'll talk about later on, if you find a career in which ADHD and that multiple attention shifting and energy and hyperactivity is an asset rather than liability, then you really can become world beating, as many entrepreneurs, business leaders and sportsmen have. But I was made aware, so this is 1 in 20 of the population. So in terms of schools, that's 600,000 plus school children who are going through this. And while it's one thing for me to talk about it as an adult and all these different facets, as I say, inattention and impetuosity, all those sort of things, as an adult, that's something to cope with. But as a child in a classroom situation, that is a really tricky thing to cope with, particularly if it's not recognized and picked up, because you won't find yourself excluded, misunderstood, stigmatized, and all of those things. So it was really on behalf of those people and children and picking it up early and advocating for them, because I felt that these people have such ability, but if it's not picked up early and if they're not understood, if they are stigmatized and excluded, we are losing one of the most talented and exciting and able cohorts of our society.
I think it's a really good point you make, because with children, I mean, everybody says, well, aren't all children a bit inattentive and a bit hyperactive and a bit impulsive? And the answer is, of course they are. The difference with ADHD is that these naturally occurring things happen in a more extreme form in childhood. And I think that's probably where it's most noticeable. For you as an adult, though, Rory, you kind of came to a diagnosis in midlife. So why did you wait until midlife before you decided to actually pursue a formal diagnosis? What was the rationale behind that?
Well, as I say, I think it was to cut through realizing a relative of mine and what they were experiencing absolutely chimed with my own experience. But what I wanted to do was to advocate quite early on, and I realized what I wanted to do in a way for ADHD what Stephen Fry had done for bipolar. He made a documentary about it, and so I thought I want to understand this, but in the process of my journey of understanding, I want to share that, and I want other people to come to terms to understand it through that journey, if you like. So I waited till I did a documentary. Why not have your diagnosis done on air, as it were? So that's what we did, and I was diagnosed by Phil Asherson, who you know very well, and it was a difficult experience, I think, for a lot of people being diagnosed with ADHD. Although in a way, it doesn't tell you something that you didn't know already, because if you go for a diagnosis, you know you're pretty sure you recognise the things I've talked about already: the inattention, the irrepressibility, the impetuosity, the mind shifting, all of that. You recognise those, and it's funny. I said to my agent the other day, I said, how many comedians and artists, I mean, these are people like Eddie Izzard and Lee Mack and Ross Noble and so many of our most, and Ronnie Ancona, so many of our most talented comedians. And I said, how many of your clients do you think have ADHD? And she said, I should think probably all of them. So it's absolutely a sort of a characteristic, as it were. But I thought I want to, is the diagnosis itself, as I say, it doesn't tell you something you don't know already, but there is no sort of, there's, how can I put it? There's no sort of objective diagnosis. It's done through a sort of questionnaire in a way, and through assessment, and through an assessment with a clinician, in my case, Professor Asherson, and you go through, it's a sort of questionnaire almost process. But I was really upset the next day because I realized I'd spent all day during my diagnosis concentrating on the areas where I fail. As a performer, so much is about your success and about confidence, projecting confidence and success. And the day of your diagnosis, you're saying, you know, are you distracted, you know, some of the time, all of the time, most of the time? And I was marking myself very harshly. And it is a characteristic of ADHD people that you do beat yourself up a lot. And I would say early on that if you have people in your experience or people in your class or whatever who have ADHD, we are world experts at beating ourselves up. And so if we are picked on by a parent or a teacher or whatever, that just not just doubles, but squares our pain, because this is something also called rejection sensitive dysphoria, which you already feel if you've forgotten something for the nth time, or if you have blurted out something which you shouldn't have done and regret it. You know that, and you're beating yourself up. And if a teacher or if a parent picks up and you know, balls you out for it, I mean, it is extremely painful. So that the diagnosis that I had was a difficult moment for me, but sort of very quickly the rest of the documentary took over. And you know, I've had so many people since sort of saying, you know, I can relate to how you felt. I went and got help. I spoke to a doctor. I spoke to a counsellor, and in many of those cases, they said it's transformed my life, because I was able. It's something we talked about before, Tony. It's that once you have an understanding, once you have a handle on it, once you think, do you know what? I recognize that there is a name for this condition that I feel. There is a whole set of understanding and a toolbox and people that I can talk to, and support groups.
Well, I think the other thing is to remember is that there are some pluses in many sense, Rory's. Your creativity and your success is also down to your ADHD. But often when people talk about ADHD, it is, as you say, from that deficit perspective. It's about what people can't do rather than what they can do. And yet we know the research tells us that over 30% of entrepreneurs have ADHD, that university graduates with ADHD are twice as likely to start their own business. We know that many successful companies have been recruiting neurodivergent sort of talent for quite a long time, and there are certain skills and advantages and assets that come with ADHD, which when you manage ADHD properly, then you really start to see the benefits of it. So for somebody like yourself who's always been a workaholic, I think for many people who have been sort of described as workaholics, that often that what we're seeing there is that hyperactivity expressed in the form of drive and enthusiasm and ambition and commitment. So it is sometimes about flipping that narrative, isn't it, and trying to find a way of making sure.
Yeah, those statistics that you mentioned, you must underline them later on. I mean, I was talking about where I felt sort of depressed, or that I was challenged by it or whatever. But those figures, the number of entrepreneurs, the number of sportsmen, the number of business leaders, because of the energy, the creativity, the ability to think outside the box, all of these things. And I'm just going to come on to in a sec, you talking about it in the context of neurodiversity. But it's worth sort of pointing out it is a question of coming to terms with it as well as an individual. And some people, they go to medication, and medication is remarkably successful, isn't it? I mean, I just ought to mention very briefly, the people that I've come across and have spoken have said, and this is not a medication that takes months to go on and months to come off. It can be titrated. You can dial it up, dial it down. It is very helpful in many cases.
Well, pharmacologically, it's one of the most successful compounds that was ever created. If you think that the effect size, for example, of Prozac, a well-known antidepressant, is 0.3, compared to the effect size of methylphenidate, which is the main ADHD medication, which is 0.9, then you'll get a sense of just how effective it is. But I think, again, there's been a lot of myths, isn't there, about medication, and particularly for children, that there was this idea that ADHD was about naughty boys, which we know is complete nonsense, and that medication helped them behave, which is also complete nonsense. There's no such thing as a morality pill, and it's not a neurological El Dorado either. What it does is it just makes your brain work more effectively. And because in ADHD children, there is a developmental delay in certain parts of the brain, so they often appear 2 or 3 years less mature than their peers. And I think sometimes that's misinterpreted as context inappropriate behavior, when in fact it's not intentional. It's just that they don't have some of those cognitive competencies that other children their age do. They do eventually catch up in their late teens, and that's when I think many people with ADHD have started to gravitate towards careers and lifestyles that suit their particular, which is why we see so many people in certain industries, particularly the creative industries, but increasingly technology as well. But in terms of the effectiveness of medication, what it does, it is a cognitive enhancer, and just for children particularly, who are having to concentrate for sustained periods all day and not move about as much, which from an evolutionary point of view is not really how children were designed, then inevitably that's where they're going to experience the most difficulty with ADHD, is in a school setting. In a career, then, where people have chosen their career and played to their strengths, then obviously that's when it becomes more of an asset. And as I say, managed well. There's lots of very happy, healthy, successful people with ADHD. So I think it's about stripping away some of that sort of, some of those enduring myths and stigma and stereotypes, actually, and seeing it for what it is, which is a cognitive difference, in the same way that dyslexia is a cognitive difference. And,
Yeah, I'm just picking up on that. You said earlier on, previously, I mean, over the centuries, originally it was almost seen in moral terms, as bad behavior, and then later also behavioral terms, and now increasingly, the thing about the brain and neurodevelopmental, during the course of the documentaries, I was able to see, and this is when I say it's our time now, that science is catching up. You can see in brain scans. And if I were to show you a brain scan of a child of 9, let's say, with who had ADHD, and then compared that with the brain scan of a child of 9 who is what we call neurotypical, the difference is really profound. Imagine looking at in the neurotypical case, it would be like, that a map of the world, or a jigsaw map of the world, and with, by and large, it's been mostly filled in. A child of 9 with ADHD, if you look at the brain scan, there'll be whole chunks of the jigsaw missing because the pieces haven't been slotted in yet. And those networks of the brain, particularly, which are particularly responsible for cognitive, for executive functions, and things like that, those networks are not as established. And for example, the part of the brain that processes, that inhibits impetuosity, that stops you from blurting out, that stops you from being impulsive, that is a part of the brain that is developed more slowly. And you can actually now do tests, and we did a test in the documentary that showed this. And this is why it's funnily enough, was why for comedians it's good, because for comedians it means you're missing that filter. Somebody like me, Mac, you think, God, he's so fast, the speed of thought. But actually what's happening is, as a comedian, you're having an idea and bang, it's straight out of your head because of that impulsivity, because the part of your brain that regulates that is underdeveloped. And so you can see that word development, and it's something you've spoken about beforehand. You can see on the scans, you can see that thing. It is not a question of something behavioral. It is a neurodevelopmental thing. Okay, I've talked a lot about sort of my own sort of experience of it. And as I said, I mentioned medication. There's not a cure as such. And I know, Tony, you would say, why would you want to cure something which gives you such ability? We'll talk about that in a sec. But there's not a sort of a one size fits all thing, but there are ways to manage it. It's about recognizing it and managing it. And it's about, as a teacher in the classroom, it's about recognizing it in the classroom and managing it by being able to support the pupil, support the person, and not to exclude them, because so readily becomes that model of children who are seen as being disruptive, and they keep getting into trouble, and so they are excluded from the classroom. They fall in with a bad crowd. They fall in with like-minded people who are not unintelligent. They have fine intelligence, great intelligence, but actually they have that hyperactivity, which means that they think differently, and they don't match that regimented classroom style. And my message from this, one of many messages, is to think about that child not as a candidate for exclusion, but as an asset that you can use within your classroom, and that would help them. But Tony, increasingly you've been, I mentioned at the beginning about the neurodiversity, and if you could talk a little bit about what we mean by neurodiversity, and also that this is something that it exists for a purpose in our society.
Yeah, well, what I'll do right now, if that's okay, Rory, I'll share a few slides for the audience, because I think sometimes pictures do kind of help paint 1,000 words, don't they? And
unless you're using a roller.
Yeah, just a second. I just need to move the screen on. I mean, really, again, it's this idea that, we all know that biodiversity is absolutely essential to the planet. And there's now a recognition that, neurodiversity is also part of the universal design, because nobody's brain is the same. Everybody looks different. Everybody sounds different. There are 7 billion human beings, and there's not one of us alike. Our brains are as unique as our fingerprints. And what we now understand is that, such as the prevalence of dyslexia, what we used to call dyspraxia, developmental coordination delay, things like ADHD, autism, dyscalculia, which is a kind of number version of dyslexia, that actually there are 1 in 5 human beings who are neurodivergent. Well, if 20% of the human race have these different minds, just because they are the sort of 10% that fall either side of the standard distribution curve doesn't mean that they're disordered or abnormal. Actually, we need to understand this from the perspective that, there is an evolutionary reason, an evolutionary purpose why at least 1 in 5 of us have these different types of minds. So therefore, we maybe need to start thinking about this not as in terms of disorder or errors of genetics, but actually understanding that human intelligence and this huge diversity of human neurocognitive capacity is something that we need to look at in the context of a new paradigm, if you like, of what we mean by intelligence, what we mean by ability, and how we actually measure it. And we've had conversations before, haven't we, where and just now, Rory, where we're talking about, you know, people learn to play to their strengths. There are certain skills and competencies that you will have that will enable you to really thrive in a particular career or a particular context. There are other contexts where those same skills and competencies might not be as valued. So when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about the combination of knowledge and skill plus context equals competence. There are some things I'm very competent at, but there are other things I am not. And that is true of all of us. It is about functioning rather than IQ. But I think within our education system, because we've often measured intelligence, usually in the form of written exams at the end of the year, then obviously for somebody with dyslexia, for example, it wouldn't matter how bright you were and how knowledgeable you were, your ability to actually put that down in the form of a written evidence piece of work that testifies to your, you know, your knowledge and skill, you're going to underachieve in that exam because your ability to actually put that down in a way that we measure it traditionally is going to be different from other pupils.
Absolutely. You just think for a moment about A.A. Gill, who's a brilliant columnist and a brilliant writer, and he wrote a wonderful book about his struggle with alcoholism called Poor Me. It's brilliant, and you'll know about A.A. Gill, very famous television critic. He was profoundly dyslexic, and at school he struggled with this and was marked very harshly, very badly. And he had a teacher saying to him that I can't mark this. You're just completely dyslexic. And A.A. Gill, being sort of quite controversialist, just said to the teacher, "So, well, that's your problem, not mine." And he flipped it on its head. And he said, "It's your problem because you can't understand the way that I'm writing this down." And what he did later on in life, he dictated his work, and so he would dictate all his articles. And I mean, I would have loved to have been one of the stenographers taking down, because he wrote these brilliant articles. But when he had somebody who could write it down without the difficulties of dyslexia, but could actually write down what came out of his brain, it was brilliant. And so, you know, this is not a lack of intelligence. This is just an impairment, rather like visually. I mean, you often talk about if people have a visual impairment, Tony, there's a simple technology of glasses, and this is sort of what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, and if we actually remove the impairment by using assistive technology or some other different type of teaching strategy, then we're actually enabling that young person to overcome. And I do think actually impairment, it's an impairment in the context of the classroom. It's not an impairment in the context of certain careers, such as yours, for example, or many others. You know, the best example of that is Steve Jobs. You know, you think about, he's a man who coined the phrase "think differently." And if you look at all the major growth industries that are really influencing the 21st century in terms of our culture, our economy, the way that we communicate, then we're looking at the big tech companies, aren't we? Microsoft, Apple, Google, Sony, and so on. These companies have been recruiting neurodivergent employees now for well over 20 years. They recognized that they needed people who think differently if that's going to give their business a competitive edge, if they're going to be innovative, if they're going to be inventive. And yet, while these major growth companies in robotics, media, bioscience, engineering, particularly a lot of neurodiverse talent, technology, have been actively recruiting neurodivergent talent, and yet neurodiverse children account for 7 out of 10 of exclusions in our school system.
It's interesting. I mean, I'm not a huge Dominic Cummings fan in other contexts, but you'll remember a year or two ago that Dominic Cummings put out a kind of call really to people who were neurodiverse and thought differently. And of course, that was caricatured in the media as a call for, was it weirdos and misfits and stuff like that. What he was looking for was exactly these kind of divergent, neurodiverse intelligences. And I mean, just give you one example. I mentioned Countdown earlier on. I mean, I did Countdown last year when they had the champions. It was around Christmas. They had the champions. And I walked into the studio, and the people who were Countdown champions, I mean, Tony, you and I joke about this, but you know, you recognize it in another person. It's that Indian thing about namaste. But if you're kind of on the spectrum, you have a very good antenna for other people who are on that spectrum, and you see the positives. And I mean, I would see people in that studio, Countdown champions, and I would go, I think they're mild. They've got sort of mildly Asperger's or mild autism. You know, they wouldn't make eye contact in some cases. You know, they looked slightly different. They look what we would describe or caricature. I wouldn't, but we would caricature as being geeky or nerdy or whatever. My God, their brains. They were people that you would just love to have in your company, because these were the best in the country. And on the maths, you know, the numbers part of the game, brilliant. And on the letters and things. And so these were the best in the country who happened to be who happened to be labeled or happened to be put into that box marked on the spectrum.
But actually, if you think about it from a business point of view, Rory,
Yes.
and we all like to be around people of like mind, and we like people who see things the way that we do. We like people who agree with us. We like people who affirm our thinking and our perception of the
Familiarity.
world. Absolutely. And actually, the challenge there is that if you have a load of decision makers around the table and everybody is of like mind, all you're going to get is more of the same. If you bring in neurodivergent talent, if you bring in people who see things differently, who are big picture thinkers, who are sometimes obsessive about detail and process, but you bring them all together, then not only are you going to come up with something that is infinitely more dynamic, which is what all these big major growth companies have been doing, but actually what you're also doing is you are able not just to anticipate emerging trends that will be beneficial to your business or organization, but actually you can also start to influence what those trends are. Apple is a perfect example of that. But it takes having different minds around the table in order to be able to do it. And the irony of it is, all of us are surrounded by very successful people who are on the autism spectrum, the ADHD spectrum, because it is a spectrum of traits, with dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, so on and so forth. We're surrounded by them, but we don't see them because we don't associate successful people with this term that we use in education called special educational needs. And we're seeing a lot of children now saying, don't refer to me as being special educational needs, because for them it connotes bottom set, low intelligence, you know, not fitting in, being isolated, not like everybody else. And actually, it's not the case at all. It's just that actually that 20% of learners somehow seem to underachieve in our education system because we don't quite understand how we can adapt our teaching to make sure that we enable them to achieve their potential, but also that we look perhaps at more creative ways of measuring their intelligence and skill and ability in an examination context. You know, and I think there's an opportunity there in terms of how we really bring out that talent, because the world needs neurodivergent talent.
So who is neurodiverse? You said there's something like one in five, isn't it? We're talking
Yeah, 1 in 5.
20%.
Yeah, you have most common one is dyslexia, which affects about 1 in 10 people. But ADHD affects 1 in 20. Autism spectrum about 1 in 50 now, they reckon. And it's always been there. It's not like there are more people who are suddenly emerging with these different minds. They've always been there, but we've perhaps labeled them nerds or weird or odd or underachievers or you know, people who didn't fit in. Because let's be honest, within our education system, we prize uniformity, don't we? We have very often a command and control structure. There's a lot of safeguarding. We're looking after lots of vulnerable children. and uniformity makes it easier for us to manage them, and I understand that, but not at the expense of enabling intelligence and potential and creativity.
You had a slide, I know, next one or two, but it shows in terms of each of those conditions. I'm not going to call them disorders, but in terms of that they present challenges, and people see them in terms of challenges, but they are also, if you flip it, that reference you said earlier on about getting away from that deficit model and thinking in terms of strength-based, and you went through each of those. Could you just give us a little jog through that?
For example, with dyslexia, we know that people with dyslexia are incredibly creative, but their minds work in ways where they're able to see patterns and information in ways that the rest of us can't. And obviously, people are probably aware now that the likes of GCHQ and MI6 are now recruiting people with dyslexia for that very reason. People with autism, I mean, we always use the expression here, if you want a really good project to succeed, you have a visionary creative, somebody with ADHD, and then you have a really good project manager, somebody with autism, or variation somewhere in the middle, I guess. But what you have then is that vision and that end goal. But then you sometimes need those different minds to give you that logical, sequential process of how you actually arrive at the end point. But I think for those with ADHD, they start at the end point and try and work backwards. And I think this is where bringing different people with these different minds together is really important. Now, not everybody with autism is great at computer coding. They're not all like Rain Man. People with dyscalculia, who have difficulty with abstract mathematical concepts like multiply times divide. If you've got dyscalculia, you can be the brightest person in the world, but you're never going to achieve in mathematics. But it doesn't mean to say that you're not intelligent. And yet we know that they have this ability to identify patterns and strengths. Similarly with dyspraxia, or what is called developmental coordination disorder. A lot of overlap with ADHD there, but also poor motor problems, or so there was a clumsiness often associated with dyspraxia. Dysgraphia, again, is where sort of the communication between the brain and your hand in terms of your handwriting is somehow disrupted. It has a different circuit in the brain, and yet we also know these people have incredible creativity, incredible auditory recall. And similarly, in terms of all of these different conditions, we see what's known as sensory processing difficulties, where some people really are sensitive to bright lights, lots of noise, and it's really tough for a child who's got sensory processing difficulties in a school. And yet you could say, well, actually, having those kind of sensory enhancements could make certain careers really work for you. And I'd love to have a conversation with Jo Malone, who's a very successful entrepreneur who has dyslexia, but I wonder whether she's also got sensory processing difficulties as well, because her olfactory capacities in terms of her sense of smell of what have made her career. So it is about looking at it in the round in terms of, ADHD I mentioned before about, these are naturally occurring things that we see in children, but in a more extreme form. But if you look at inattention again, as you said before, what is it? It's about concentration, it's about working memory. But it's actually also incredible imagination, that mind wandering that gives you those genius aha moments, because inattention is a brain craving stimulation in terms of intellectual stimulation. The impulsivity of ADHD could also be decisiveness. It can also be action orientated. It can be, again, that light bulb moment, in the same way that hyperactivity, incredibly distracting in the classroom, but as an entrepreneur or as somebody who runs a business, then being hyperactive is described as drive, enthusiasm, commitment, workaholic. It's about how you interpret it and flip that narrative from a negative to a positive. For me, impulsivity means decisiveness, inventiveness, curiosity, inattention, yes, distractibility and mind wandering, but it's also that need for novelty and new learning. And we know that an ADHD brain, for example, while it has some difficulties in terms of working memory, frontal lobe, holding lots of information in your head, because they tend to think in pictures. We know there are greater synaptic connections in the part of the brain that deals with spatial intelligence, which is why you see so many artists, golfers, big picture sort of policy thinkers around, well, this is what we need. There are two ways of looking at it. And again, I think it's about, let's understand that we're talking about a whole spectrum of neurocognitive capacity in human beings. Some of these controls, for those of you that can remember graphic equalizers, are fixed when, genetically, but there are most of most of the slide controls in our brains are movable, particularly in childhood when the brain is going through this major growth spurt and this massive neurogenesis. And that's the optimum time. And this is why, I think, we know that children who learn to play a musical instrument in primary school actually have enhanced mathematical ability. Some of the arts actually are incredibly good at that brain development sort of that happens in early childhood. And I think, we need to think about how the environment can influence where these different slide controls are. And we know that some of those slide controls work better in certain contexts, but we know that in a classroom context, a lot of these children do really struggle because the way their mind works is just not always what we expect or want from children in a classroom, which again raises questions, doesn't it?
I keep thinking of Boris Johnson or Trump, and he should never particularly good examples as necessarily as role models.
Really to diagnose.
But I'm not a Boris fan, but he is an exceptional politician. He is
great orator.
He's a say again.
He's a great orator.
Well, yes, he is, and he's a winner in the Brexit, that argument, and at the election, and there is, I'm talking objectively. You cannot deny that the majority that he got at the election, and I think of him as a cheerleader rather than a leader, because his skill, as you say, is his enthusiasm, but he does look. You could just look at him. He looks like a man who combs his hair with a balloon. Because it just goes, and there's that sense of chaos and of hyperactivity. But so there is a value, but he would need somebody alongside him who could actually catch these ideas and see them through.
So I would understand why his hero is Winston Churchill, can't you? Because a lot of people say that historically, if you read and again, not sort of entirely appropriate clinically, but if you actually read sort of Winston Churchill's biographies and the fact that he needed to take an amphetamine in order to be able to concentrate in long cabinet meetings and things like that, there are lots of traits that Winston Churchill had that are quite typical of ADHD. Now, obviously, he wouldn't have got a diagnosis, and people don't say that because that's a terrible thing to say about a national hero. But actually, in many respects, they were the things that made Winston Churchill such an incredible orator, leader, and a man who was able to see not one step ahead, 2 steps ahead, but 5 steps ahead of everybody else.
Absolutely. Let's just step in there to say about beating yourself up and sort of saying that it just an immediate sort of point you were making just then, because we time and again people they're very, very self-critical and very negative about themselves. And what I say to people time and time again is I know what it was. It was because I lost concentration briefly there. It was about being. It's what makes you who you are. That's what it was. It was you made that point about, for all these things there put together, what made Churchill who he was. And I think of an analogy with this sort of Swiss train system, because I sometimes think people think, well, the Swiss, they're very linear in the way that they think, and this is, I know, sorry to be racist if you're Swiss, but they tend to think about being very, very organized and very rational and that kind of thing. but it makes the trains run on time, if you like. It's a very efficient country, and you may think of some things that are deficient in terms of imagination or sense of humor or whatever. If we're talking about a cliche here, okay, but it's what makes them who they are. It's what makes these people who are.
Comes back to context, though, doesn't it? In the right context.
Yes,
people
absolutely.
Will cry.
We want to leave time for questions. We touched on executive function, just that last sort of thing about what it is, and
it's about the ability to regulate your thoughts and emotions and put them into an order that suits whatever particular task you have to do in hand. And a lot of people who are neurodiverse have difficulty with executive functioning, but there are lots of strategies that teachers can employ that will help students overcome some of those executive functioning skills.
This is what, so teachers pay attention. This bit comes up. So
well, I mean, we haven't really got time to go into sort of all those strategies now, but again, I think it's about teaching people the right way. And I mean, on this slide, you've got two examples of two young people who are two of our young ambassadors. You've got Sienna, who has ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and dyspraxia, and struggled all through school and felt isolated and bullied and didn't achieve in a lot of the humanities subjects and everything else, although she did achieve in maths and the sciences. And her school were even going to enter her for her A-levels because they said she would underachieve. She got 3 A stars in maths, physics, and pure maths last year, and she's won a place at Stanford. They only ever in the USA, they only ever accepts 4% of applicants. She is a genius, but without a computer, her written literacy is obviously going to be poor, and it's in those subjects that she struggled. Now, often that child would be deemed as low ability, low intelligence, because her ability in terms of written evidence was impaired, and yet she is a mathematical genius and an incredibly gifted scientist. The young boy, Marcus, has ADHD, autism, and dyslexia, and also has attachment disorder. Actually, he's a looked after boy. He was formed an attachment with his primary school teacher when he was 8. They changed his form tutor, and he couldn't understand what the reason or the justification for that was, because he'd formed an attachment with this teacher. And the head teacher said, no, you've got to go and have a form teacher, a new form tutor. So Marcus then hacked into the school server, changed the password, and refused to give them the answer until they told him he could have his old form teacher back. And that made perfect sense to an 8-year-old boy with autism and ADHD and attachment disorder. Marcus went on to achieve one of the top 10 highest SAT scores in the country 2 years after being permanently excluded. And he's already started his GCSE, 10 GCSEs at 14. So again, it's about, if we understand how children's minds work, then we adapt our teaching and learning to facilitate that. And, these young people and many others like them achieve incredible, incredible things. And isn't it our job then, as childcare professionals, as educators, to really bring out the best in young people? And that's really kind of why I just kind of wanted to finish on this slide, is that actually maybe we need to start thinking about cognitive profiling as a way of saying, well, what are people's particular strengths and what areas of learning do they struggle with? And actually, okay, now we know how we can adapt teaching and what accommodations to put in place for those areas of the curriculum where they might struggle more. And we now have an understanding why one child is absolutely massively exceeding in all other subjects except maths, and we can see, well, maybe there is some dyscalculia there and some impairment in that part of the brain. We'll give them other strategies that will help them overcome it. And I think, using exams as a way of measuring a child's ability, I think sometimes doesn't tell us about what that innate potential and ability is, and then we can personalize learning more successfully.
I particularly found on that thing about not only exams, I mean, it's well documented that people with ADHD struggle with exams, but I find multiple choice as a particular thing very difficult, because let's say, all right, let me give you an example. People say gin and tonic. Yes, but also people say, yes, exactly, indecision. But also people say gin and tonic. Okay, it's 1 part gin, 3 parts tonic. Okay, and if you're on a multiple choice thing, it says gin and tonic is made of 1 part gin, 3 parts tonic. Second, 3 parts gin, 1 part tonic. Whatever. As ADHD, you will as impetuously you will see 1 and 3. You go, okay, I know it's 1 part this and 3 parts that, and and you'll press the wrong button. And
Or you
whatever.
can overthink. You can overthink. You can see that many different possibilities that actually it almost causes you to procrastinate. You can see potential and
Absolutely.
possibilities that other people can't. Yeah.
I think it's worth looking into that. That's the whole thing about exams. Okay, very quickly before we go to questions, and literally is like 10, 15-second thing. Tony, what are there resources that teachers could go to for that particular, we talked about beforehand about how to not just cognitively profile, but how to deal with this? Are there specific resources you have?
Yeah, there are a lot of resources on the website, and we can provide sort of virtual training but I think that the good point to start is change your perception and look at those children in your schools and colleges who have these different minds and see it as a different type of intelligence. That is not to kind of dilute academic excellence in any way, but it is about understanding that, as I say, neurodiversity is part of the universal design, and we are missing a lot of potential if we don't identify it and we don't enable those children to thrive in those areas of cognitive capacity that we know they're really good at. And it would enhance both the quality of their experience of learning, but also it would really help them in terms of their ability to achieve their potential across the lifespan.
Okay, brilliant. Ian, I'm going to bring Ian back in because we've got some questions, I think. I mean, I don't know. I've got two screens here, one saying we're coming close to 5 o'clock and another one saying we've got sort of 19 minutes remaining. I don't know, but whatever we do have is we now have some time for some questions.
Great, thank you. We depending on your time, we do have a little longer than just the last 5 minutes, just because the next talk has actually been postponed. So that's entirely up to you. So we've got a little more flexibility. A couple of really interesting questions. An anonymous question here from someone who would like to know more about the extra sensitivity to criticism and how to manage that.
Okay, well, that's something I came across sort of frequently in the sort of correspondence that I sort of have and the websites that I go on, and that's a term, rejection sensitive dysphoria. And I mean, as I described it, I think it's part and parcel. It is, you are acutely sensitive to criticism, and I think, as far as I understand it from a personal point of view, I think is because when you failed again, you're the first person, you're your own harshest critic. I talk about ADHD as being my best friend and my worst enemy. Best friend, as I've mentioned, because it makes me who I am, and as a comedian, and it's that speed of thought, that the leaps of imagination or whatever. But worst enemy in the terms, it's not fun to forget something again. It's not fun to go into a supermarket with specific instructions to get 3 items. And I call it the middle of Lidl syndrome. You walk into Lidl and they look at what they've got in the middle aisle, and you come out with a canoe. And your wife says, well, hang on, I thought you went in there to get some milk and some bread. Why have you got a canoe? Tony, what do you make about that?
I think there's a number of things involved here. I mean, we know that people with ADHD can be incredibly empathic and sensitive. And again, that's a double-edged sword, isn't it? But I mean, I think also if you think about it in the context of being a young child, particularly if you're hyperactive, you've got this innate ability to want to learn about your environment and explore your environment, and also this instinctive need to stay near a primary caregiver. But if you're a parent of a hyperactive child, you're going to be at your wits' end sometimes, because they're going to be climbing over the back of the sofa, or they might run out to the road, or in the classroom they're constantly being told, sit still, sit down. And yet we know the more they move, the better they're able to concentrate, which is the strange counterintuitive thing, is that is why they're hyperactive, because when you move, you produce more of this chemical in the brain called dopamine, which really helps with concentration and learning. So again, the more structured movement there is in a classroom, the better for all learners, because we know all children's cognitive function is enhanced by movement. But for the parent, and particularly if you think about our expectation of, parents often want to be perceived as good parents who have good children. Children who sit still and are not heard. Well, so no such child exists. But for the child with ADHD, who is perhaps, the child that is taking risks and not understanding, as children don't, that they might hurt themselves or things like that, then they're going to be sanctioned repeatedly, and they're going to be sanctioned repeatedly in the classroom for not paying attention, for not trying hard enough. And I think over the course of a child's life, I think pervasive levels of criticism inevitably are going to impact on somebody's sensitivity. And it's not, again, because these children are deliberately not doing as they're told, or because they're not listening to instructions. It is sometimes about that developmental delay that makes it harder for them to be as compliant, perhaps, as we would expect them to be. And I think that might have something to do with it as well.
Great, thank you. After hearing your middle of little anecdote there, Rory, I'm wondering whether the concept of ready, steady, cook was invented by someone with ADHD. what can you make from the following 5 random?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
It's true.
An interesting question here from Deepanjali, who's logging in from India. What are your thoughts on allowing self-regulated movement in the classroom to enable ADHD students to participate without feeling boxed in?
I think it's down to the teacher to actually design and deliver the lesson so that there is a lot of structured movement. In other words, you know, the classroom learning space is designed in such a way where we do have children moving about, because we know that movement improves cognitive function for all children, but particularly for children who have, inattentive delay, particularly the children who are the youngest in the year, the ones born June and July, who are less mature than their peers, but also for the children with ADHD. So it's about, I think, rather than, you know, free flowing, you can get up and do what you want at any time. I think, you know, using standing desks is a great tool. I've seen desks with rubber bands, even desks with bicycle kind of foot pedals on them. But I think it's about, you know, Kagan's work is great on this. He was a dramatist, but structured movement built into the design of the lesson is the optimum way.
So something on a very, very small scale, a very sort of weird thing. I've noticed that often when I'm concentrating, I doodle frantically on sort of a piece of paper. And I only recently sort of saw that actually I'm doing that because it enhances my concentration. And I wasn't aware that and again, it's a weird thing. We sort of characterize doodling as a lack of attention, but it's anything but actually. It's because I realize that on a very small scale, it's a certain amount of movement, and I'm sort of keeping, I'm keeping the dopamine flowing around the thing. We haven't touched on it beforehand, but so the chemical explanation behind ADHD is this idea that the brain is not producing enough dopamine, which is the neurotransmitter, which is the chemical which both rewards and stimulates us. And so if doodling is keeping your engine running while something, then it's something which actually enhances your concentration rather than diminishes it.
Yeah. Thank you. Interesting. Have we got time for just a couple more questions? Are you okay?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
great.
I would point out from attention deficit point of view that England have just started their game against Germany. But I'm not watching that screen at the moment.
No, we'll expect John Motson to start commentating in a moment, Rory.
Yes, if I may say so, yes, it's a very real possibility. Goodness me. How many footballers have ADHD, by the way? That's what I'd like to know.
I would think a very significant number of them. I know lots of professional sportsmen and women who have ADHD because, as you mentioned before with comedians, Rory, that lightning quick impulse is actually a real asset on a tennis court, on a football pitch, on a rugby pitch. It works really well. It's an instinctive, quick, lightning quick response. Off the pitch, maybe not so good, but on the pitch, a real asset.
I mean, would you imagine, I mean, again, it is highly unprofessional and I'm just using it as an example, but you would think of somebody like Paul Gascoigne who, so he, as you say, struggled off the pitch or in many ways, but that speed of thought, his spatial awareness and all the rest of it. So I think you get the whole package of a brilliant footballer, but whose brain is in the best and in the worst sense all over the place. I mean, an incredibly fast thinking spatial brain. So strengths and weaknesses. But forgive me if that's the wrong diagnosis. I was using it for illustrative purposes only. Asterisk, disclaimer, close asterisk.
When taking a test for ADHD, how do you make sure you're being as honest as possible in your answers?
You use a QB test, which is a computer-based, objective, quantitative cognitive functioning test that's about 83 to 86% accurate, and that will give you a clear indication of what your cognitive profile is. And then that, alongside the clinical interview, you put the two things together. So one tells you about brain function, one tells you about how you function occupationally, behaviorally, emotionally, and then you put the two things together. So you can have somebody with what you might call because I don't think, talking mild, moderate, severe actually is really unhelpful. It is a spectrum of traits. Not everybody is hyperactive, not everybody is impulsive. You only need to have two of the core characteristics to get a diagnosis. But in terms of how we measure it, you can have a mild or a less severe cognitive ADHD profile, but struggle a great deal. And then there are other people who might have a more extreme ADHD cognitive profile, but are functioning really well. And this is about then, these are these individuals who have learned to understand themselves, manage it well, make the right lifestyle choices, and also know how to play to their strengths in terms of their career. So it's important that we use both that health tech way of helping us understand somebody's neurocognitive profile, and then also that clinical interview in terms of how it is actually affecting them in day-to-day life and what they can do to actually change that.
Great, thank you. I have a final question that's been sent to me off Slido, actually. It's about, with the best of intentions, we use the phrase "on the spectrum" to illustrate a continuum, if you like, of neurodiversity, from what might used historically to be called completely normal to having some sort of disorder, and yet, in an attempt to create this notion of a spectrum or continuum, we actually inadvertently create a label, which is in itself a category.
I think the problem is not so much, we need identifiers, don't we?
Yeah.
We all have to have identifiers, particularly because we're not all clinical experts. So having an identifier is fine. The problem about labels is not the actual identifying label, although we could do with getting rid of the acronyms like disordered, because I don't believe that, unless your life is significantly impaired, that you would define yourself as disabled or disordered. I certainly don't define myself that way as a man with ADHD. But I think we need to look at it in the context of it's the stigma and the prejudice and the stereotypes behind the labels. Yeah. And we would really like to see this acronym called ADHD, this acronym that dare not speak its name. And I one of the examples I use here, Ian, is everybody has a great deal of sympathy towards people on the autism spectrum. But a lot of people don't understand that about 60% of people with autism also have ADHD. And also, when you look on all the websites and you go to conferences, about autism, it's very rarely that you will find somebody actually speak about co-occurring ADHD. And yet there is a strong genetic link and overlap between the two. And that again demonstrates, doesn't it, culturally, we need to think about what are the prejudices and the underlying kind of stereotypes and stigma that we have with certain labels. And of course, with ADHD, this thing, wasn't there in the 80s, about, oh, well, it's all about naughty boys, which we know is complete nonsense. I think it could really do with a change of name, not just because of the stigma, but as Rory rightly pointed out before, attention deficit is a misnomer. And I think disorder is a misnomer. And we use the term disorder in medical language for those people that fall on the edges of the standard distribution curve. Well, I'm sorry, but we need to get away from this idea that just because you're on the end of a standard distribution curve, whatever the etiology of our language, that doesn't make you abnormal and everybody within the standard distribution curve normal. It is about actually accepting and looking at this through a neurodiverse paradigm where we think, actually, it is all normal because that is part of the universal design in terms of human neurocognitive diversity.
What's our current candidate for the new acronym for ADHD?
There's a few kicking round. I'm not sure what's the best one. Somebody's got one called Vast. But for me, I just think, I think probably the best way forward would just be, you have neurodiversity, neurodiversity A, neurodiversity B, neurodiversity C, because they often overlap. And also the term neurodiversity has been, again, the way language evolves. If you look at the Oxford Dictionary, if you have one of these different minds, you're defined in the Oxford Dictionary as neurodivergent. So again, the implication there with language is you are diverging from the normal. So many people who have ADHD, dyslexia, autism, dyspraxia actually identify as neurodiverse, which is really a quality of populations. But they don't want to be defined as divergent, because actually the paradigm is saying, well, actually, this is normal. We just need to understand it from,
diversity is a positive. I also struggle because people who have OCD, which I think is a bit of a misnomer, not least because the letters are in the wrong order. It should be C and then D and O. So that must really piss them off. But anyway, that's just my stupidity. That's the ADHD kicking in, as it nearly did earlier on when your lovely Liverpool accent, Tony, when you talked about Apple being a perfect thing, and I'm just thinking apples, pears.
Sorry.
Ian, I think we've reached the end of it. I mean, I watched Tony's presentation, some of the slides of which he's used to illustrate today, and I just want to thank you, Tony, again for just laying it out in such a fascinating and articulate and interesting way. For my own part, I probably need to apologise to, in no particular order, the Prime Minister, Donald Trump, anyone who's Swiss, possibly, which I was just using as a very loose analogy, and anyone else whose toes I may have trodden on, because that's the world we're in. But I hope that's been interesting. I've been very pleased and happy to take part in the Education Festival again. And thank you for what you're doing. And thank you again, Tony, for all that you do. As Tony mentioned, that there are resources there to help teachers further sort of take on that some of the areas that Tony talked about today.
Yeah, thank you both very much indeed.
Hang on, sorry.
Sorry, just saying you can contact me directly if you need to ask any personal questions, or I can just be contacted directly. I'm aware that this isn't the best forum, is it, for everybody asking questions and open debate. It's not like being in a training room. But yeah, please feel free to contact me if anybody would like to ask anything. But thank you, Rory and Ian. Thank you very much for asking me along, and thank you to all the audience as well who've been taking part in this webinar. I wish you well, and I hope you've had a fantastic experience.
Right, thank you both very much indeed. If we were in a real room, there'd be a rousing round of applause, but if we can just imagine that. And I wish everyone a really wonderful evening.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front line.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's wellbeing. This starts with a clear understanding of what wellbeing is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of wellbeing and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well Charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.